We continue with our last speaker, Dr. Hrvoje Čapo, our historian from Croatian Institute of History, about whom you learned more from Mr. Harris this morning. So he's our final speaker, and then we move to the panel discussion, Bleiburg and the Way of Cross, where Božo Vukušić is going to join us. Hrvoje, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mate, so much. May I just try the presentation? In Europe, after the victory over the Third Reich and its allies, two models of retribution were implemented, models that no but can equate. One focused on the perpetrators of crimes and collaborators of fascist and Nazi regimes, while the other also included a crackdown on dissidents and potential enemies of the new authorities. One led to the preservation of the continuity of non-totalitarian judicial processes, while the other was based on implementing a wartime revolution and strengthening the victorious regime. One was founded on the democratization of society and just punishment for committed crimes. The other was rooted in the consolidation of power and elimination of potential opposition. One was the Western model, the other the Eastern model. Ultimately, they divided Europe into democratic and communist parts. The Western model of retribution aimed to preserve conventional legal frameworks, encourage reconciliation, and look toward the future. The Eastern model served to solidify communist power and shape and ideologized historical memory through a fervent defense of the narrative of revolution and a fixation on the past. Everything I will talk about today has been known for decades. The West, which wanted to forget, was the first to start re-examining its model of retribution already from the mid-1960s. The East, which was not allowed to remember, began to reflect on its model of post-war retribution only in the 1990s, after the collapse of communist regimes in Europe. Transnational comparison of these two models began at least a quarter of a century ago, and yet conferences like this one are still necessary. Recently, I had the opportunity to review a reader for European schools titled Lest We Forget, Memory of Totalitarianism in Europe, published by the Platform for European Memory and Conscience. Its goal is to illustrate the impact totalitarian regimes, fascist, Nazi, and communist have had on societies through individual biographies of people affected by them. This reader is certainly a very successful project and a welcome addition to the teaching of history, but I mention it here only as a symbolic example of what we are discussing at this conference. Namely, the reader includes stories from 24 European countries, almost all of Europe. But when we place them, but when we place them on a map, we get an interesting picture. Apart from Slovenia, we see a void in the area where communist Yugoslavia was established in 1945, of which Croatia was also a part. We can certainly agree that Yugoslavia was not a beacon of democracy, and that is perhaps why we now see it as an island in the European collective memory of totalitarianisms. To me, this image symbolized the still present exclusion of historical insights and the unnecessary ambiguity surrounding the evaluation of what communist rule brought to Yugoslavia and likewise to Croatia from 1945 onward within the broader European context. The chart, borrowed from the same reader, which shows totalitarian and authoritarian regimes in Europe during the 20th century, clearly illustrates that 1945 marked a significant turning point in the transfer of part of Europe under communist regimes. And while we can talk about some differences between these regimes, the policy of retribution that led to the establishment of communist rule was at its core the same across all communist regimes. The only thing endemic was the intensity with which it was implemented, And in Yugoslavia, especially in Croatia and Slovenia, that intensity was by far the greatest in Europe. This chart shows the number of people killed in the wild purges per million inhabitants. The highest concentration of red appears precisely in the territory of communist Yugoslavia. For Croatia, that number ranged from 13,410 to 14,630 killed per million inhabitants. We get a clearer picture if we add to the map a line that roughly marks the demarcation between the Western Allies and Soviet troops as of May 12, 1945. What followed clearly illustrates the importance of this demarcation line. Along almost the exact same line, Europe became divided into communist and democratic parts. Of course, Spain is not included in this representation. But the presence of Western Allied troops therefore played a key role in preventing the imposition of communist regimes in Europe. The decisive influence on Soviet control in Europe was the advance of the Red Army, but Yugoslavia was unique in that regime because it was established under the monopolistic control of the Yugoslav communists themselves. Two decisions made at the Tehran conference in 1943 were crucial for this outcome. One was the decision to begin active military support for the Yugoslav partisans. The other was the decision not to carry out an Allied landing on the eastern Adriatic coast. The moment it was decided at the Tehran conference that there would be no American or British landing on the eastern Adriatic coast, the post-war fate of Yugoslavia was effectively sealed. Without Western Allied troops on the ground, it was clear that post-war Yugoslavia would be shaped by those who had the strongest resistance movement. From that moment on, it was also clear that this would be the partisan resistance movement with a distinct communist orientation. At a moment where the Potsdam Conference began, after the end of the war in Europe, mass retribution in the liberated territories was already in full swing. The West had already witnessed wild purges driven by revenge and was aware of their negative impact on post-war recovery. The wild purges in France were probably the most intense. They had begun even before the Normandy landings, with around 2,400 people killed, reached their peak during the landings, about 1,500 killed, and then gradually subsided in the immediate post-war period, around 1,600 killed, eventually giving way to formal judicial proceedings. At the same time, the commander of the American occupation forces in Germany had received clear and detailed instructions on the implementation of retribution. Germany will not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy nation. Your aim is not oppression, but to occupy Germany for the purpose of realizing certain important Allied objectives. In the conduct of your occupation and administration, you should be just but firm and aloof. You will strongly discourage fraternization with the German officials and population. The intensity and character of retribution models in Western and Eastern Europe depended not only on the political regime that implemented them, but also on social mentality, the crimes committed during the war, the burden of historical legacy, national homogeneity, and social polarization. Hence, there were significant differences even within the same models. Retribution in the West and East was therefore not the same everywhere. In the West, the identification of Nazi and fascist collaborators ranged from the broadest interpretations to the narrowest definitions. Millions of people in Germany and Austria were subject to investigations. Most of them were eventually amnestied. On the other hand, Norway sometimes extended the blame for collaboration with the Nazis even to the children of those same collaborators. Nevertheless, Western states collectively chose democratic judicial processes aimed at delivering just punishment and moral satisfaction to the victims of fascist and Nazi regimes, while also rebuilding society with a balance between necessary punishment and amnesty that offered a shared future, through one still marked by some wounds that never fully healed. Stalin, however, had a different view of retribution at a Potsdam conference. He stated, "The feelings of revenge and retribution are poor guides in politics. We should be guided in politics by the calculation of forces." However, the strength of the USSR was at a turning point following the challenge of June 22, 1941, when, after the German invasion, the Soviets ordered to all communist parties around the world, through the Comintern, to assist the Soviet Union. On that very day, Stalin instructed Georgy Dimitrov, the General Secretary of the Comintern, "For now, the Comintern is not to take any overt action. The communist parties in the localities are mounting a movement in defense of the USSR. The issue of socialist revolution is not to be raised. The Soviet people are waging a patriotic war against fascist Germany." Dimitrov immediately carried out the order and instructed the Yugoslav communists to join the anti-fascist struggle and carry out sabotage operations behind German lines. From that point on, the Second World War was no longer viewed by communists as an imperialist conflict. Only then, after 1939, did the war, from a communist perspective, became an anti-fascist war. The Comintern had temporarily forbidden communists from fighting for socialist revolution in order to gain broader support for the USSR. The Comintern was not interested in justifications. It demanded a rapid and powerful military response from its communist affiliates. However, by the end of June 1941, the Yugoslav communists were not yet able to deliver what was demanded. First, they had to ensure the survival of their small numbers by going underground. The Yugoslav, including Croatian communists, withdrew into illegality on June 22, 1941, with the aim of avoiding arrests, preserving communist activity, remaining loyal to the party and the Comintern, and seeing themselves as members of the Red Army, working toward the very goal that was ultimately achieved after 1945. Revolutionary struggle was never excluded from communist plans. The post-war future with a reconstructed society was the ultimate goal of the communist fight. That is why Stalin's lesson at the Potsdam Conference is a clear indication that revenge was not a motive behind the communist revolution. It certainly was not confined to just a few weeks after May 8, 1945. Rather, it was used as a method of revolutionary struggle throughout the entire war. The spokesman of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia's ideological policy, Milovan Đilas, clearly contributed to that goal. For example, in 1942 he stated, "Remember that the great leader of advanced humanity, Comrade Stalin, said, 'The enemy cannot be defeated until one learns to hate them.'" In 1943 he continued, "Do not try to re-educate them. Do not waste time. Do not argue with them. They know what they are doing. Kill them like dogs, as they deserve. Avenge our innocent victims, the villages and towns turned into ashes." The monolithic nature of communist regimes was thus achieved by excluding emotion in service of politics. Revolutionary terror in the East and executions without trial or with merely superficial and retroactive judicial rulings were part of institutionalized plans to realize a communist social order. These actions began from the very first moment of power being established in the conquered territories, and even long before May 1945. Therefore, equating the punishment of crimes and even acts of revenge in the West with the systematically enforced repression and crimes, not merely isolated incidents in the East, serves only to trivialize and justify communist wartime and post-war terror. That Yugoslav communists were faithful adherents of Stalinism and in many ways even more ruthless was clear to the Allies even before the end of the war. During preparations for the Yalta or Crimean Conference in February 1945, the Americans had a following assessment of the partisans, Yugoslav partisans. We could say frankly that Marshal Tito and his subordinates have not shown a disposition toward cooperation or even common civility in recent weeks. His refusal to cooperate in military plans is beyond the scope of this paper, but the attitude on questions of relief, negotiations, censorship, instructions, refusal to grant travel facilities for Allied observers, the partisan territorial demands, and propaganda policies all show that the partisan leadership is not disposed to work in loyal cooperation toward the general aims of the United Nations. And also, official and unofficial reports received from Yugoslavia point to the probability that large-scale executions and confiscations of property of persons opposed to the partisan movement are taking place. All indications point to the intention of the partisans to establish a thoroughly totalitarian regime in order to maintain themselves in power. Such conclusions were only confirmed after American diplomats established their mission in Belgrade. Hrvoje Čapo, the charge in Yugoslavia, reported to the Secretary of State in September of 1945. Yet a relatively small group of communists, inspired and directed by Moscow, had succeeded in foisting a ruthless totalitarian police regime on the Yugoslavs. An all-pervading sense of fear dominates the country. It is manifest everywhere, in both private and public life. In the cities, the regime has its committees and spies in every house and block. Its opponents live in daily fear of arrest by OZNA and punishment as enemies of the people. There is no sadder commentary upon this situation than remarks of people who defied Nazi military might at its peak that perhaps Hitler was right after all. On all sides, one hears that in comparison with OZNA, the Gestapo was a mild institution. Immediately after the elections in November 1945, US Ambassador Richard Patterson reported to Washington. Contrary to the wishes of the great majority of the people, the present ruling clique under communist control maintains itself by force and secret police as a satellite of the USSR. Democracy, freedom, and civil liberty, as we understand these terms, do not exist. The small communist group in control is dominated by a few fanatics, mostly from backward areas, who have no use for Western democracy and would not easily give up their seats of power in Belgrade to return to their barren homelands or relinquish the armed power and communist organization now in their hands. The East, under Soviet influence, coupled the punishment of war criminals and collaborators with a search for enemies of the people, those considered a threat to the establishment and maintenance of the communist social order. OZNA's instructions for entering cities were clear. The arrests of enemies of the people should be carried out at night and executed according to plan. Already on the first night, all hardened and incorrigible criminals can be arrested. The remaining arrests will be carried out gradually. The Eastern model had no desire for continuity with pre-war norms. It was designed to fulfill revolutionary goals and create a restructured society. The methods used in its implementation destroyed the remaining intellectual, administrative, religious, and economic foundations that could have helped stabilize post-war societies, societies that were instead deliberately led into a future marked by decades of repression under political monism. The severity of this repression was primarily determined by whether communist power could be established without interference from the Western allies. Retribution was more ruthless in places where communists held absolute and unchecked control. And that is why the Yugoslav communists did everything they could to prevent the presence of Western allies on territory under their control. Just one day after the capitulation of the Third Reich, on May 9, 1945, the Yugoslav communist authorities requested that the American and British military missions leave Yugoslavia. At the same time, they made life difficult for their diplomats' missions in Belgrade in every possible way, mainly through intimidation of the arrest of the embassy staff or people who were in contact with them. As we have seen, the number of people killed in the wild purges in the territory of Yugoslavia, especially in Croatia, was the highest in Europe. This model undoubtedly belonged to the Eastern model of retribution, which included the settling of scores with those the regime identified as its enemies, the so-called enemies of the people. Following the Stalinist model of retribution, this purge included not only actual war criminals and Nazi collaborators, but also other groups that, under disguise of an anti-fascist, through in reality communist revolutionary struggle, were targeted for elimination from society. These included class and political opponents, as well as entire ethnic communities, particularly Germans, Italians, and Hungarians. We have already had the opportunity to hear all about this at this very conference. We also heard that in Yugoslavia, the organization and execution of the elimination of enemies of the people was carried out by the Security and Intelligence Service of the partisan movement and the communist regime OZNA, later UDBA. It is known that preparations for the removal of enemies of the people had already begun during the war, and OZNA's list included everyone the Communist Party perceived as a threat. The communists were bothered by all wealthier citizens, priests, lawyers, civil servants, intellectuals, artists, and everyone else who did not fully support them, along with a large number of members of, or even just sympathizers of the Croatian Peasant Party, and all those who could relate to the West. Thanks. In dealing with all of them, in the immediate post-war period, methods of wild purges were used, including tolerated arbitrary executions, which, just like in the West, significantly declined as the regime consolidated. However, unlike in the West, they were not replaced by democratic court proceedings, but by show trials that fulfilled the will of the regime. The architects of an atheist society naturally saw a threat in religious communities, especially in the Catholic Church. The universal nature of Catholicism was problematic for them due to its supranational unity, and therefore the Church was labeled as an agent of imperialists. When it refused to submit to the regime, efforts were made to sever the Church's connection with the people, including through trials of its leaders. The most notable example was the 1946 trial of the Archbishop of Zagreb, Aloysius Stepinac. With the end of the Second World War, Europe began its search for justice for the crimes that had been committed. This pursuit led to division. The communist ally from the East did not accept the model of retribution proposed by the democratic allies from the West. Eastern retribution had a different goal: to create communist societies based on the Stalinist model. Communists deliberately used the pursuit of war criminals and fascist and Nazi collaborators to settle scores with class, political and ideological opponents. The West moved toward economic recovery, progress, and democratization, while the East reinforced the ideological monolithism of its communist regimes. The retribution that had begun continued in the following decades through forms of political repression and ideological indoctrination. After the mass elimination of all real, imagined, and potential opponents of the new authorities, the majority of the remaining population, impressed by the severity of the purges, submitted to the communist regime. That is why Europe cannot remember May of 1945 in the same way, but it can unite in inheriting the memory of the consequences of the totalitarianisms of the 20th century. Thank you so much.